Previously on Decolonizing Museums, Part 1.
Rather than pitting one party against another in the way that Western contracts often do, where it's about limitation of liability, by aligning ourselves together as sharing responsibility and placing all rights with the work itself, then we become the accountability for each other.
Have a history of wading into difficult places and situations and working to try, in the best way that I can anyways, to sort some things out.
There's a lot more that we have to do, and much of that work, that healing, is what we've started to do through ceremony here in the museum.
Decolonization is an idea that people are talking about in museums across Canada and around the world. Last week, we focused on the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where there was initially some controversy about whether to use the word genocide in relation to residential schools. More recently, however, a museum on the West Coast has been making headlines.
Stafkalas Henodikian, Dio Hadagang, Dio Odagang. My name is Lucy Bell Stafkalas, and I come from the Haida Nation. I was the inaugural head of the Indigenous Collections and Repatriation Department at the Royal BC Museum for about 3.5 years.
Bell resigned from her position at the Royal British Columbia Museum last summer, and she did so in a dramatic fashion.
I'm going to rip the Band-Aid off, and I hope that you have the patience, the love, and the understanding to sit with me and listen.
Making a parting speech wherein she outlined her grievances.
I don't think they knew what I was going to say, but I could feel it kind of bubbling up in me, and I just really felt like I needed to address it, and I needed to speak my own truth. So in my speech, I thanked my colleagues for my learning, for the experience, but I also spoke to some of the examples where I was really hurt in my job.
Bell says the final straw prompting her decision to leave happened during an anti-racism meeting. She says the meeting was organized by well-meaning museum employees in response to the Black Lives Matter movement and protests in support of Wet'suwet'en land rights. At the meeting, someone said something that left her stunned.
We were all asked some questions, and one of them was, when did you realize you were different than other people? And one talked about Native people needing to ask white people to buy their booze, to stand outside the liquor store and ask white people to buy their booze because they weren't allowed in the liquor store. And it really felt inappropriate, it was wrong, it was hurtful, and I felt like I was the only one in my group that was shocked that he would use that as his example. And I went to the boss and told him about the situation, and nothing was done about it. And that was when I decided that for my own well-being, for my own safety, for my health, that I couldn't do this anymore.
Another factor in her decision to quit was the lack of support she felt she was getting while pursuing her PhD at Simon Fraser University, which is where APTN Investigates interviewed her.
When I took the job, I was told that the museum was supportive of people furthering their education and that I would be supported in pursuing my PhD. And that really was something that I was really excited about.
But that story didn't have a happy ending.
And some people, I think, were not as supportive. And I was told to either quit my PhD or take a demotion if I wanted to continue my PhD. It really pissed me off. As an Indigenous woman, I have a right to my education. I have to show my daughter how to navigate this world, and that she can navigate and walk in the Haida world and in the academic world. I barely asked my employer for anything but a bit of time off, a little bit of money for me to catch the ferry, because I had a lot of sponsorship and my community was supporting me.
And so Belle decided to leave her job. And that triggered an investigation. And others have since left their jobs as well.
Well, my speaking out has led to an investigation. It's led to the museum hiring a diversity expert. It's led to many people being asked to take early retirement, being asked to go on leave until the investigation is done. I wish it didn't have to come to this. I wish that I was working in a place where I was respected and where Indigenous people and other people of color were truly respected. I didn't expect to see all of this, but sometimes that's what needs to happen.
What does Lucy Bell think needs to be done to continue decolonizing museums?
Decolonizing museums should not be left to the handful of Indigenous people that work in museums. It's like it's piled on. Do my job and then decolonize the museum as well. It's got to be the whole institution. It has to be the people who think it's not their job. They have to step up and do that as well. It means honoring UNDRIP, knowing what UNDRIP is, and responding to the calls to the TRC.
The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, and the Truth and Reconciliation Report are two major reasons why museum decolonization is on the radar of pretty much every museum in the country. Articles of UNDRIP relevant to museums wanting to decolonize include Article 12.2, which reads, "States shall seek to enable the access and/or repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains in their possession through fair, transparent, and effective mechanisms developed in conjunction with Indigenous peoples concerned." And also Article 15.1, which reads, "Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information." And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reinforced UNDRIP in its calls to action, notably in Call 67, which reads, "We call upon the federal government to provide funding to the Canadian Museums Association to undertake, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, a national review of museum policies and best practices to determine the level of compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to make recommendations." Repatriation of ceremonial objects and human remains has been a focus of Lucy Bell's career.
I helped my Haida community bring home over 500 of my ancestors, and we We traveled the world looking for our ancestors. And it took over 20 years, well over $1 million of our own money to bring home our ancestors.
And Belle found her passion for repatriation early in her career when she was interning at the Royal BC Museum.
I could hear, sounded like children playing in the stairwell, and I knew that those were ancestors, the spirits of ancestors connecting with me.
Belle learned that remains of her ancestors, children included, were being kept in museums around the world, and she decided to do something about it.
I thought I could just get chief and council to take care of it. I could just go and deliver them the news and give them some papers, and they'll take care of it. But at the time, I was surrounded by my late mother and all of these wonderful nannies, the grandmothers, and for people at this big meeting kept saying, "You're the one," and that I had to bring our ancestors home.
Indeed, they did. She told us it took a lot of fundraisers and fried bread. But Lucy Belle got so good at repatriation, she wrote a book about how to do it with museum colleagues. One of her co-authors, Luann Neal, is still at the museum, and she told me how the book not only was a hit with Indigenous groups in BC, but worldwide.
Within a couple of days of our introducing the book online, I had calls from Spain, Brazil, all over the United States and Europe.
We asked to speak to the CEO of the Royal BC Museum. We were going to ask him to comment on Belle's allegations and how the museum planned to move forward. Instead, the museum directed us to Neil, the acting head of Indigenous Collections. The museum did not authorize her to comment on Belle's allegations. However, she was more than happy to talk about decolonization in general. Neil has a passion for repatriation that developed in part because of an experience she had that connected her powerfully to her past. Neil was doing artist research at the Burke Museum in Seattle, and she had asked to see a particular rattle.
And I picked it up and I shook it, and it felt so familiar and it sounded so familiar. So I asked the collections manager, Justin, could you please go and pull the card for this and tell me who carved this rattle? And it turned out that my father had carved that rattle, and I never met my father. So it was a really, still gives me chills telling that story, how my dad's energy was in that piece. And what it actually did was it expanded what I thought repatriation meant when I first heard the term. At first I thought it was about retrieving those cultural treasures and bringing them home. But what I learned was to really look at how many pieces are really fragile and need to stay somewhere safe for the time being.
Repatriation is a key component of decolonization, and after the break we'll hear from a gallery CEO in Saskatchewan who recently arranged for the return of a statue stolen in India more than a century ago. It's not every day that an art gallery in Regina makes the news in India. But that's what happened, thanks in part to the new director and CEO of the Mackenzie Art Gallery, John G. Hampton. Hampton, who has Chickasaw heritage, curated a recent show at the Mackenzie featuring work by artist Divya Mehra. One feature of the show was a bag of sand, presented instead of an idol of the Indian goddess Annapurna. This was a sort of cheeky reference to Indiana Jones. But it was also because of something Mehra read about how Norman Mackenzie, a Regina lawyer and art collector who the museum was named after, originally obtained the statue.
Divya pulled out this impressive leather tome of Norman Mackenzie's recounting of his various journeys and the objects that are held in the University of Regina's collection that we care for here, and that it was clearly a stolen object. And so she requested right at the beginning for this work, can we try to send this back to its rightful home, which I very quickly said yes, without thinking about all of the intricacies of that would be involved in that, just of that's something that we had to do.
Mackenzie's account of taking the statue makes it clear that it had been stolen.
He was on a trip across the Asian continent at the time, and was on a boat traveling down the Ganges River, and came up to a ghat, the steps that lead down into that river, and saw a shrine, an active shrine where people were worshiping, that had three idols, three of these sculptures, and he said that he wanted one of them, and his guide told him that it'll never happen. This is a Hindu will never part with their god, is what he said, but he saw someone lurking in the shadows that overheard him and knew what he wanted.
The man in the shadows later came by Mackenzie's hotel room with all three statues.
But Norman said, well, I can't take all three of these. It would be a great offense to the British government. So you put back the two larger ones, and if I see they've been returned to their shrine, then I'll purchase the smaller one from you. And so that's how he came to acquire it.
But fast forward to present, Annapurna is being returned.
It's returned to Varanasi, which is the city that it was removed from. Also, the Annapurna has a very special relationship with that city. She's known as the Queen of Varanasi.
A virtual repatriation was held in December of 2020, which included participants from the University of Regina and the governments of Canada and India.
I don't know if we can see that. Can you see that clearly? Okay, I don't want anything to happen to it. So here is the statue, which after approximately 1 century, 100 years, will be returning home to India.
All told, it's been a very happy ending to the story.
We've gotten direct messages, emails, and thanks from Indian citizens, both here in Regina and also from various places around India, just thanking us for doing that. And Prime Minister Modi did make an address to the nation. I think his words were, every Indian should be proud on this day to have this object returned. So it was quite moving for us to see the reception in India.
And Hampton says the Mackenzie Art Gallery is committed to going even further with repatriation.
So there's a few objects that we're doing further research on. I wouldn't make a judgment on them yet, but we are likely to see further repatriation efforts needed.
Not only that, but Hampton is also working on a show idea for the gallery that turns the old colonial idea of what a museum is pretty much upside down. In the past, museums have looked at Indigenous cultures through a colonial lens. But in an upcoming collaboration with the Art Museum at the University of Toronto, The Mackenzie Art Gallery will scrutinize the idea of whiteness. They're calling it Conceptions of Whiteness.
And it looks at the origins, the travel, and the mythology of this concept of a white race. So we've been doing a lot of research about why and when this concept of whiteness was invented, which from my understanding it's an invention of the 17th century and really a North American invention and necessity for all of these Western nations that are coming to a new territory that normally would view themselves as very separate nations and not feel aligned as one like unified white culture.
Hampton says the idea of what white means in a racial sense was something that was cultivated for colonialism.
It was a tool for classifying degrees of humanity, that we civilized nations that are colonizing this territory, we have a rule of civility. We'll treat each other a certain way and respect this decorum amongst each other, which is distinct from the savages of this territory.
And Hampton points out that the museum's namesake once said something quite interesting about Indigenous people and their relationship to whiteness.
There's a really interesting passage from Norman Mackenzie, actually, in his biography, where he speaks about his respect for Indigenous people. And he says, I forget the term he uses at the time, I'll just say Indigenous, but he says he has a great respect for Indigenous people because above all other races, they have resisted being subsumed into white identity, which is a very loaded statement, and I think problematic in some ways, but also accurate in other ways, because we've resisted this assimilation and cultural genocide and still have our identities today.
And if Mackenzie was onto something, that strength of Indigenous identity, he noted, might be just what is needed on the road to decolonization.